Hey, this is Mr. Justice, and we're going to talk about the carbon cycle. This is 1.4 in the APES curriculum. We're going to talk about the carbon cycle. We'll talk about the movement of carbon between different sinks and sources. We'll talk about the length of time that carbon can exist within these different reservoirs and how they can be different. We'll discuss two major processes, photosynthesis and cellular respiration. And then finally, we'll talk about how combustion is returning permanently stored carbon back into the atmosphere. So the carbon cycle is the movement of molecules that contain carbon between different sources and sinks. Those molecules that can contain carbon are things like carbon dioxide, CO2, glucose, methane, CH4. Some of the processes of the carbon cycle can happen very quickly, as in the case of fossil fuel combustion, right? There's carbon in fossil fuels, and when it's combusted, it releases that carbon back up into the atmosphere in the form of CO2, and that happens relatively quickly, right? Think about it. To store the carbon into the fossil fuel, that happened very slow. It was a really long process, but the combustion of it happened pretty quick. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And then some of the processes can be very slow, like in the case of sedimentation and burial. If there are more inputs into our atmosphere than there are outputs, right, we're going to lead to an imbalance then between these different carbon sinks and carbon sources. And that imbalance could lead to global warming, an increased level of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. So you've heard me say a couple times the carbon sink, right? A carbon sink is a carbon reservoir that stores more carbon than it releases. Some examples of this is the ocean. The ocean is a huge carbon sink. Quite a bit of the carbon dioxide in our atmosphere actually will dissolve into the ocean at its surface. Other examples of carbon sinks are plants. Think of all of the carbon that exists within a gigantic sequoia tree, right, for example, or really any vegetation that exists in the form of the cellulose that makes up the cell walls, or the glucose that are stored within their cells. Soil is also a source of carbon sink. There's a lot of organic matter in soil, and that organic matter can be released if decomposition occurs. So carbon sinks, right, are reservoirs that can store carbon. So what are the sources then of carbon, right? These are different processes that are going to add carbon into the atmosphere. These processes are, I mentioned before, fossil fuel combustion, right? Different fossil fuels like oil, coal, and natural gas can be burned. Any combustion process creates carbon dioxide as a result. Other sources of carbon is animal agriculture, right? Some of the gas that those animals produce, methane, contributes to global warming as well. Deforestation is a source of carbon. As large stands of trees are cut down, that carbon dioxide that was stored within the trunks of each of those trees can be released. So photosynthesis is a process that occurs by photosynthetic plants, algae, and phytoplankton. This process removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and fixes it into carbon. It fixes the carbon rather into glucose and other carbon-containing organic molecules within the plant, like cellulose, which makes up their cell walls. Glucose, if you recall from high school biology, freshman biology, is the organic form of carbon. It's stored chemical energy that's in the form of sugar. And everybody needs it, right? Every living plant and animal needs it. Because carbon dioxide is entering into the system from the outside, it's considered a carbon dioxide sink. Respiration is a process done by plants and animals and releases that stored energy from the foods that they eat, glucose specifically, right? It's important to note here that plants are doing photosynthesis, undergoing photosynthesis for themselves. Plants have mitochondria just like animals do. And so the plants are creating the sugars, and then they're using the sugars for themselves. Plants are able to get those sugars too by eating the plant, right? Through herbivory. The process uses oxygen gas to help break down glucose and release the energy so that the organisms that use it can continue to live, reproduce. This process releases carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. And so because of that, cellular respiration is a source of carbon dioxide, right? It adds it to the atmosphere. Take a look at the image in the center. I want you to take a look at and write down these equations into your notebook, being very careful about the arrow direction, all right? For example, notice that the reactants, the ingredients, so to speak, what goes into the photosynthesis process is water, carbon dioxide, and energy. Notice that the products, right? Look at the arrow here. The products of respiration are the reactants of photosynthesis: energy, water, and carbon dioxide. Likewise, the products, what's made after photosynthesis occurs, is what's required for respiration to occur, right? So both of these processes happen very quickly. This cycling of carbon dioxide between the biosphere, the living world, the living tissues of the world, and the atmosphere. And this process happens at more or less a balanced rate, right? So there's no net increase of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The plants are taking in the carbon at the same rate that the carbon is exiting out of the living world too. Another carbon cycle process is called exchange, and this happens right at the surface of the ocean. So what's going on is that the carbon dioxide will move directly between the atmosphere and the ocean. So it can go either in or out of the ocean in a process called exchange, right? So it can dissolve in and dissolve out. Now, here's one of the problems with this, right? It happens at pretty much equilibrium, right? Between equal rates between exchanging in and exchanging out. So think about this for a moment, right? If we start to burn more fossil fuels, we start to increase more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And so as that carbon dioxide then dissolves into the ocean, what happens is it creates a more acidic environment. This process is called ocean acidification. When CO2 gas exchanges into any body of water, it turns into carbonic acid. So normally the pH of the ocean would be slightly alkaline. So the more CO2 that exchanges into the ocean, the more carbonic acid we make. And so we start to lower then the pH of the ocean from what it normally would be. Other organisms that use the carbonate that exists within the ocean are the photosynthetic algae and phytoplankton. They're taking in carbonate from the ocean and performing photosynthesis, producing glucose from it. Other organisms that use the carbonate that exists in our ocean are coral reefs. They have the calcium carbonate shells or exoskeletons, right? Or really any marine organism that has those calcium carbonate shells are also using that carbonate to live and reproduce, right? Sedimentation is another process here that happens in the ocean. So sedimentation occurs when dissolved CO2 is called carbonate, reacts with calcium ions in the water, and they precipitate out of solution, right? So it's no longer an ion, it's now a piece of sediment. That sediment can start to deposit on the benthic regions of the ocean, and over time, a process called burial will happen, right? So sedimentation and burial oftentimes goes hand in hand. Burial is a slow geological process. It's part of the carbon cycle, and it stores carbon in underground sinks and reservoirs like those of sedimentary rock or fossil fuels. So with sedimentary rock, these layers of sediment, right, start to accumulate on the bottom of the floor of the ocean, like calcium carbonate. That's a molecule that is made as a result of sedimentation on the previous slide. Shells made up of calcium carbonate coral over time start to accumulate in layers. They're compressed under high pressure and after a long time form into sedimentary rock like limestone. Fossil fuels can be formed after burial too. Plants, fern, peat compress to form coal, and marine algae, plankton compress to form oil and natural gas. The coal that we're using is around 250 million years old. and the oil and natural gas is estimated to be around 140 to 180 million years old. So this process is really long. You have to think of it, right? Take a look at the diagram that you see here. In order to form this oil and coal, we have permanently stored, pretty much permanently stored, the oil, coal, and gas, that carbon, in the lithosphere. And through anthropogenic processes, us, right, through the extraction of it and combustion, we're returning that carbon where it used to be out of the atmosphere. We're returning it back into the atmosphere. That can cause all those problems that we were talking about earlier. So extraction and combustion is absolutely a part of our carbon cycle too, right? We're digging up, mining fossil fuels, we're burning them as an energy source. In that process, every combustion process will release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So here's a key point from this slide, right? The burial and the formation of those fossil fuels takes far longer than the actual extraction and combustion processes. That means that we're going to increase the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at a greater rate, right? Take a look at this diagram here. I like this one because what we can do is we can actually see the different processes in a different format, right? Take a look. We've got 101.5 petagrams of carbon per year entering into the biosphere in the form of, or the process of photosynthesis, right? And then cellular respiration returns pretty much the same amount of carbon back into the atmosphere too, right? Take a look at this, oceanic carbon. We have quite a bit of carbon entering into the system, and then we also have it exiting the system more or less in this same amount, right? And so what's really causing that imbalance between the stored carbon in our sinks and the atmosphere here is this, right? For about 250 years, we have been releasing that permanently stored carbon back up into the atmosphere and causing problems as a result. Take a look at that imbalance here, right? Try to do the math too. Subtract. There's more carbon exiting the lithosphere and entering into the atmosphere than it is being stored in the hydrosphere and other places. All right, so here's our practice FRQ 1.4. What I'd like you guys to do is turn this into our notes. So no matter what happens, any lecture, any slideshow that we ever do, there's going to be a practice FRQ. I'd like that to be written out however you're doing notes, on your Google Doc or your physical notebook. So you can push pause on this, try to answer this. I've also put this prompt onto Canvas. In fact, for this one, I'd like you guys to actually write it out into your notes, and then I'd like you to transfer it into Canvas, because I'm going to read it and give you specific feedback. All right, so push pause on this or check it out on Canvas, and we'll see you at the next one.